Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Maartje.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're talking about The Imitation Game, which is a film that came out in 2014. It was directed by Morton Tildum and written by Graham Moore. With us today is George, who is usually our SAS Rogue Heroes correspondent, but who wanted to talk about something other than SAS, and who, unlike both of us, has been to Bletchley Park as it stands today. Welcome, George.
Hello, glad to be here.
So, this movie is based on the 1983 biography Alan Turing, The Enigma by Andrew Hodges.
Are you sure?
Yeah, we have some thoughts on this, y'all. It's a 660-page biography, and I read it over the last couple weeks and then had some strong thoughts and feelings about the movie. But anyway, the movie received 8 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, and it won for Best Adapted Screenplay somehow. And it focuses on Alan Turing, who was a British mathematician, codebreaker, and early computer scientist. The film in particular focuses on his role in cracking the German Enigma code during World War II. So, what did you guys think of this movie?
Oh my goodness. What? I would say words can't express how much I don't like this movie, but that would make it a really bad podcast. So many words are going to express how much I do not like this movie. It's bad.
I think this movie is a great work of fiction. That's what I think about it. Like, if it was a fictional story about someone we did not know, who didn't exist, who wasn't portrayed in offensive ways, then I would probably find this a really exciting movie. I watched this movie 10 years ago when it came out, and I really liked it, but I did not know anything about Alan Turing, nor did I look him up. So, not knowing anything, I quite liked it. And then I watched it again and did 1 minute of Googling, and that just made me very angry.
Yeah, I saw this movie when it came out as well, and I remember not having strong feelings about it, I think. I just thought it was a classic, glossy Hollywood biopic, and I didn't do too much research into it beyond that. And then I read the book, and I didn't really remember very much about the movie. And then I watched the movie, and I was like, oh my God, I'm not even convinced they wanted to make a movie about Alan Turing because they changed basically everything except that his name was Alan Turing and it takes place during World War II.
I do wonder if it sort of hit different because I'm in the UK. And so obviously he's been one of our quite famous historical figures. And I think when the movie came out, it was only maybe a year after the pardon. I think the movie came out 2014 and he was pardoned officially by Queen Elizabeth in 2013. So he'd been in the news. And I remember at the time knowing that this film was going to come out and looking at the trailers and thinking, this is a film that I'm not going to watch. It's going to be terrible. It's going to make me very angry. And so I did not watch it for a decade. So thank you very much for having me watch this movie so I can talk about it with you and setting my blood pressure skyrocketing.
You're welcome.
I didn't realize you hadn't seen it until I was live blogging it while I was watching, and then it became clear, and I was like, oh, you straight up just gave this a miss, huh?
On purpose.
One of my biggest gripes with this movie is that it's full of really good actors. This is a star-studded movie, and these are serious actors that people generally, I think, take seriously. If I were just an average movie watcher watching this movie with good actors in it that act pretty good, like most of it's pretty good, I would think, I bet this is a serious movie and they've put some thought into this movie. And I wouldn't look any further, and that's the problem with this movie. It's all wrong.
Yeah, it really does feel like Oscar bait. Like they've specifically made it for that purpose. So they've modified things in a way where I'm like, I don't really see how that contributes to the story to make that up or, completely change the way real events happened. But I'm like, I don't know, just me.
You mean you don't want any spies in your movie?
Oh my God, y'all. The completely unnecessary addition of a completely fabricated spy-related subplot.
Oh my goodness. That makes me so angry. I don't know if we want to go through the plot first before I tell you why it makes me angry, or just because otherwise I'll just start spewing vitriol right now.
Say your thing.
Let's get into the plot.
There's a few words that appear on the screen of the most egregious lie I've ever heard, which says, based on a true story. And then we find out it's 1951. We're in Manchester, England, and Alan Turing, as portrayed by Benedict Cumberbatch, has an ill-fated interaction with Detective Robert Knock, played by Rory Kinnear, after a burglary in his home. So we get introduced to Alan Turing, who comes across as an irredeemable asshole and completely antisocial. And this sort of interaction is going to frame the movie because we'll see Detective Knock surface again throughout.
He is playing around with some cyanide, which I thought was a bold choice for this opening scene, knowing that he may or may not have something to do with cyanide at the end of his life.
That's part of the reason why some people think his death may have been an accident, because he was doing experiments with cyanide in his home.
So it's on purpose. Well done, I guess, for actually setting that up, maybe. And so this movie follows Alan Turing in 3 parts of his life, and the second one that we go to is 1939. Britain has declared war on Germany, as we know. So, in 1939, we follow Alan Turing as he makes his first visit to Bletchley Park, and is there interviewed by Commander Denniston, played by Charles Dance. It's kind of like a job interview, and he gets the job. I think he gets like a trial job. I don't even remember. I saw this yesterday.
It doesn't matter because none of it's real.
We meet the rest of the team that he's going to be working with, led by Hugh Alexander, played by Maartje Googled, who we like. I think we all like him, right?
I like him.
We also meet, for some reason, MI6's chief, Stuart Mingus, played by Mark Strong. We also kind of like Mark Strong. We don't know what he's doing here, but we like him. And then we also get some other characters, like fellow codebreakers John Cairncross, who shouldn't be here, played by Alan Leach, Peter Hilton, played by Matthew Beard, Keith Furman, played by Elon Goodman, and Charles Richard, played by Jack Dalton. And they have one job, and it's to break the German naval Enigma code with, I cannot say this amount of possible settings for the Enigma machine.
Yes, you can. I believe in you.
Oh God, it's 159 million possible settings. So basically, it's a fuckload of settings that they can choose from, and they have to break it before the German U-boats can do a shitload of damage to the Allies. And basically, the Germans reset this setting every night at midnight. So if they don't fix it in a day, they get to start all over again. How fun.
Yeah. So Denniston actually recruited Turing more or less off the back of a recommendation based on his earlier work at Cambridge in mathematics, including one of his big papers on computable numbers, which came out in 1936. And that was the work that made him a pioneer of computer science and introduced the Turing machine to the world, which we'll hear a little bit more about later. And Alan was actually already working part-time at the British government's Code and Cipher School at the onset of the war. So they definitely are inserting some additional conflict between him and Commander Denniston that isn't necessarily true to life. And if I'm not mistaken, most of the people that appear on his team in this scene were not on his team in real life.
Yeah, I mean, for a start, Denniston's family, I think, have complained about his portrayal as generic baddie, which is understandable because I think Charles Dance is wonderful and he's always a fantastic baddie, but that's all he's doing here. But I don't know a lot about all the people named here, but I do know that Peter Hilton was not at Bletchley, I think, until 42. And I do know that John Cairncross, who we will discuss at length, was in fact a translator, and he wasn't part of Turing's team. And while he did work at Bletchley, there is no evidence that they ever even met. So we're already starting off a kind of wild, I guess.
There is a mention here in the scene, and I don't know if this is right, but Denniston says that he's just turned down one of the foremost linguists. And I'm wondering if that could be Tolkien at the time, because I think he was around at that time.
He was considered for Bletchley work, and
because who else could it be
was not.
really, if he mentions that?
I also think they might have included that because it was really some Polish cryptanalysts that originally designed the sort of prototype Enigma breaking machine. And at the time, they were already using mathematics to try and establish patterns, but the English were still heavily focused on using linguists. And so I felt like they kind of threw that in to be like, the English are still approaching this in kind of a not quite the right way. And so they're recruiting Alan Turing, but this Deniston guy thinks that when he mentions that he doesn't speak German or anything, he's like, well, how are you going to break the code? Like, he's not thinking about it in the mathematics sort of way.
Can I tell you one thing that does also irk me about this scene? And I promise I will find something positive to say about this movie somewhere. But this scene makes Bletchley Park look so scrappy. Like, they don't know what they're doing. It belittles the huge amounts of effort that is already gone into codes and ciphers and setting this all up that Turing came into. It belittles the efforts of the people who ran all the recruitment, because what you've got is Turing turning up saying, hey, I'm really good at puzzles and you need me. That's it. He's a lone genius. And that's really not how Bletchley worked. And that's going to be a theme throughout the entire film. And I really dislike that. As much as I respect Turing, he was not a lone genius. He was in a team of geniuses.
Yeah, Bletchley Park. It's an English country estate in Milton Keynes, which was the center of Allied codebreaking during the war, employing over 9,000 people. And they did not just break the Naval Enigma code there, they also broke the German Army code. There was quite a lot of different little moving parts and bits and pieces that were happening. Their work culminated in the development of the world's first programmable digital electronic computer, which was created to break that high-level German army messages, and Turing's work contributed to its design.
That's another thing you don't really see in the movie. You look at the place that they're at when they go through the gates and stuff, and it's like there's no one there. Which I think is one of your points, George. There's so many people, and you don't see any of them.
There are so many people, you don't see any of them. I mean, there weren't quite that many right at the beginning, but more than 5 guys in a hut, really. And I understand why you have to streamline the main characters, but it would have been really nice to see a little bit more of the bustle of Bletchley, I think. We see a little bit when the women turn up, but that's it.
Yeah, well, and I think 75% of the people who worked at Bletchley were women.
Yep. A lot of Wrens worked at Bletchley, a lot of the ATS. There are a lot of people around eventually.
For our listeners, can you say what Wrens are?
It was the Royal Navy sort of women's branch, and I can't remember exactly what the acronym is. I think it's just Women's Royal Navy, and that's why it became Wren. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the movie, Turing can't get funding for his new machine that he's building. He's embarked on this solo project where he's going to, all by himself, build this decrypting machine, and everyone thinks that he's a crazy person. And so he goes over Deniston's head to Churchill himself. And Churchill comes back and puts Turing in charge of everybody, and Turing immediately fires Furman and Richards. And this did not happen in real life. In real life, Turing and several other colleagues, including Hugh Alexander, wrote to Churchill in 1941 for more resources, which were granted. His coworkers did not hate his guts.
Can we talk about the stupid scene that is the eating lunch scene? We're going out for lunch. And then they make him seem like he doesn't understand what that means. He doesn't know how to communicate. It's so terrible.
It's just wild to me because in the book, we have bits and pieces of Turing's correspondence, and Hodges, who wrote the biography, spoke with a bunch of people who knew Alan Turing. I mean, this book came out in 1983, and so he was able to speak with quite a lot of people who worked with Alan and who were friends with Alan, and he was not just an inveterate asshole. He had a good sense of humor. He had lots of friends. He could be abrasive, and he could be very single-minded. And if he was working with someone whose intelligence he didn't think much of, he could be a little bit condescending. But the way they portrayed him in this movie as someone who's come here from another planet and doesn't understand how people work is a very strange choice to me.
Yeah, I get the need for some kind of arc, but they don't have to make him a villain for him to have an arc. There's other ways to, like you said, if he's abrasive, show him being abrasive, but don't make them hate him because they didn't hate him.
Right. And I think as well, it's a very Hollywood implication of neurodivergence. And it's a really clumsy one at that, because they want to set up this guy who doesn't understand any kind of social nuance whatsoever, which is not at all what Turing was like. And if you equate that with neurodivergence and then give him an arc about getting over it, that's incredibly ableist. It's absolutely appalling. And I'm afraid that it's not Benedict Cumberbatch's fault It is definitely the writing, but it is something that his portrayal leans very heavily on.
There's a scene where he's separating his carrots from his peas on his plate. Real life Alan Turing was like a little bit chaotic. He was sort of like a chaos gremlin in some ways, and I just don't think that it would remotely even occur to him to notice whether his vegetables were mixed together. And there's another scene where he tells this very stilted, not funny joke in a monotone, like he doesn't understand what humor is. And like again, I feel like you were saying, George, they just took these very stereotypical keynotes of neurodivergence and applied them to Alan Turing. And he was not, as far as we know, autistic. And if he was, these were certainly not the traits that he displayed. So
in 1928, we go back to the younger Alan Turing, where we see the pea and carrot splitting scene. Young Alan Turing is played by a boy called Alex Lauder, who is quite good, I thought, in his acting. But he has a terrible time. Alan Turing has a terrible time at boarding school, but he's introduced to cryptography by his friend Christopher Markham, played by Jack Bannon.
I am interested to know, Sam, if you found out if any of that is true.
So he did get bullied at boarding school, but so did everyone else. It just seemed like that was sort of the culture of it. And so there was at least one instance where he did get crammed under some floorboards, but apparently that was quite common and he wasn't necessarily singled out for special bullying. He didn't have a great time at school, but I feel like most of us have been teenagers and and can relate to that in some way. But he was friends with this Christopher Markham kid, and the vibe you get is that it's a bit of unrequited love. Turing was very interested in Christopher, and Christopher was his friend, but, you know, didn't return perhaps that more than platonic feeling. So, yeah, true-ish, I guess.
I think we've all been there.
We're back in wartime. New candidate Joan Clark, played by Keira Knightley, joins the team. There's this whole scene that, again, didn't happen in real life where she gets recruited based on a crossword puzzle that's put in the newspaper. And basically anyone who solved the puzzle would be invited to work at Bletchley. So there was an instance where they did put out a crossword puzzle for that purpose, but it had nothing to do with Joan Clark. And in fact, Alan Turing didn't like crossword puzzles because he wasn't very good at them. So anyway, a strange addition. But her family doesn't want her working around men. So she doesn't come into work one day and Alan's mad about it. So he goes directly to her house and he kind of helps her work it out where she can live with the women who are working at Bletchley Park. And then she'll still be a part of the team, but at least her parents will be fine with this. There's also no evidence that this ever happened in real life. It's just the addition of more conflict that, you know, didn't actually occur. And then they kind of, after that, they start to meet up after hours and swap information, and he gets her ideas and that kind of stuff.
I will put the crossword puzzle that Bletchley put into the newspaper on the website because it's quite fun. I don't know any of it, can't do it, I'm really bad at it, but it's out there on the internet, so I will share it.
I mean, I love the crossword puzzle anecdote. I do find the reliance on it in this film really irritating. After a while, I wanted to set like a drinking game every time they mentioned crossword puzzles, but I would be on the floor, I think, by the end of this movie. But I think the Joan scene where she gets recruited suffers from almost similar to the scene in which Alan's recruited, in that it actually is quite belittling of Joan and how she was recruited in real life. Her academic advisor, who's a fellow named Gordon Welkman at Cambridge, was the one who recruited her. And he was already working at Bletchley, I believe, and brought her in because she was so very skilled at mathematics. And they do mention that she had a double first in maths from Cambridge, or studied at Cambridge, women at the time not being able to get degrees. But to have her just sort of come in like, oh, I got this puzzle and a letter. Can I come and sit with the boys? It's irksome.
Yeah, it's truly wild. Yeah, it's crazy. What a choice. Just one thing I was going to add, when they were first initially working with these early versions of the Enigma breaking machines, they didn't have very many of them. They ended up having, I think, 200 of them by the end in order to more quickly and effectively crack codes. But at the time, they didn't have that many. So Alan invented this manual process called Banburismus, basically using conditional probability to determine rotor positions that were more likely, and then they could reduce the number of iterations that had to be tested out by the machine, and that would make the process much faster to crack the codes. And Joan was actually particularly good at this process, so it really had nothing to do with her being good at crosswords. And then when the four-rotor Enigma machine was introduced in 1942, it was actually her that worked out that the Germans hadn't changed the cipher from the three-rotor machine, which allowed the code to be broken. So she was quite an able codebreaker in her own right.
I would like to apologize on behalf of my people because apparently Enigma machine, or a very early Enigma machine, was invented by Dutch people. So I'm very sorry that we made that thing. So we go back to 1951, which, might I add, is a wrong year. But Nog suspects Alan is a spy, so he brings up the latest rash of outed Soviet spies, former members of the academic elite in Britain, and he's trying to prove that he's involved in some kind of espionage scheme, which he's not, and he never has been, and he was also never accused of being. So this scene is wild.
No, it's weird. It's like they didn't want to have a main character cop who was like openly homophobic because, when Alan Turing was arrested, it was literally purely for homosexual activities. It had nothing to do with any espionage or any suspected espionage or anything like that. And it's like the movie didn't want to be like, oh, this was a shitty homophobic cop enforcing a shitty homophobic law, so we're going to have him going after Alan Turing because he thinks he might be a spy.
I don't understand this either, because there is a scene where there's like three cops, and one of them is the main cop. But it's the other guy that says that it's disgusting. Just commit to the fact that people were homophobic in the 40s and in the 50s. It's not such a wild thing to portray because it was true.
Well, yeah, and I think it's particularly egregious because it almost undermines how badly Alan Turing was treated, that he has had to wait for decades to receive a posthumous pardon for this activity. And none of it was based on any suspected espionage. And in fact, we'll go into that further down as to why this becomes even worse later on in the film. It was pure homophobia, systemic and institutional homophobia.
The way the movie frames the burglary even is odd because they make some comments about how the burglary was reported by the neighbor and, oh, supposedly nothing was stolen and, oh, there's weird vibes. That is not what happened in real life. What happened in real life was that Alan Turing was sleeping with a guy casually. The guy told his buddy that Alan had a bunch of shit that's worth being stolen in his house, and so the buddy came and robbed Alan's house. And Alan reported it to the police, and then of course the cops put two and two together and figured out how Alan and the robber were connected to one another, and then Alan got arrested for quote-unquote homosexual activities. Really, the stance they take on it in the film, they make it into this whole thing that it's not. So Hugh Alexander and the other codebreakers have a knockdown dragout with Turing over his work on the decryption machine because they're spending hours and hours every day trying to crack the codes manually, and they think his machine is foolish, and they have a whole scrap about it. But as we kind of said earlier, there was an early version of the machine that tested different letter combinations that was actually invented by Polish cryptanalysts prior to the war, which was able to successfully break early German codes. So it was not a matter of Turing inventing this machine from the ground up. He kind of had a prototype to work with. And then as the Enigma code became more complex, that's when Turing sort of improved on the prototype. He designed a machine that operated on a different strategy, but it operated much more quickly and effectively than the original machine. And they called it the bomb because it ticked like one. And he did not build it himself. He simply designed it. And there ended up being over 200 bombs built, which I feel like is not the impression that you get from the movie either.
Quick, explain exactly how a bomb works.
No.
No, I couldn't either. When I went to Bletchley, there is a whole beautiful video installation describing exactly how it works with visual aids. I watched it through several times, and every time I thought, I've got this. And then 5 seconds later, like, no, I don't understand at all.
Yeah, well, there's diagrams in the book that I feel like made a super simplified version that I sort of understood. I'm like, well, I understand it enough to be getting on with. And then I just moved on with my life.
Another thing they changed for the movie that I do understand when it comes to the bomb is the fact that it ticks much slower in the movie than it did in real life. They were pretty dang fast in real life. But I guess if you're making a movie and you're making a thing go really fast and people are like, why is it not working? Whereas if you make it tick really slowly, you're gonna get the feeling of it taking a lot of time a bit more.
And don't
So
make your audience have a migraine for looking at the way a machine works on your screen.
that too. They also made it bigger than it would have been in real life, I think. They made it like this huge installation. I think it would have been smaller because there were also many more of them. And they made it kind of look cinematic and pretty, and a lot of things that would have been on the inside were put on the outside for the movie, just so we can see what is going on a bit more. Which I understand. Movie making sometimes does that. And it does look pretty. The props are good and the costumes are great, and that's one of the things I liked about this movie too.
Yeah. I guess we could say the simplified version is that if I wanted to send in a message through Enigma, it looks kind of like a typewriter. So I would type it in, and these little lights would come on where the letters did not correspond to what I was actually typing in. So that's how they would get encrypted. And then when you would get the message on the other end, if you had your Enigma machine set up in the exact same settings as mine, and you put in my gobbledygook message, then the lights would light up with the ordinary English version. And so you needed to know what the exact settings were on a given day in order to be able to decrypt the machine. And so the bomb could go through and test a lot of different settings at once. That's kind of how it works.
That was really good. I like that.
That's all I got.
In another scene where Deniston is the villain, he rushes in and raids Turing's office and blatantly tells him that he's under suspicion of being a spy. And at this point, John decides to help Turing out by explaining to him how humans work.
Joan is a lady, and ladies know how to social works, and men don't.
Yeah, men are stupid.
I just feel like there's just no nuance in it. In order for him to be a misunderstood genius, he has to be an asshole. And then there's just no, like, it just doesn't really give real life Alan Turing very much credit. So it's 1941. The team are now all working together on Turing's decryption machine. They've come around. He's named it Christopher after his first love, which of course didn't happen in real life. I believe the first bomb machine that they built was called Victory. But anyway, it's not fast enough. It's not breaking the codes as quickly as they need it to. And Deniston flips out and he's like, your machine's not doing the thing that you said it would do. And he's going to fire Turing, but everyone else comes in and is like, no, if you fire Alan, you have to fire us too. And they manage to get an extra month to work on the machine. And obviously, it probably goes without saying that none of this happened either.
Yeah, I think it can sometimes go without saying, yeah, none of this happened for pretty much the entire movie. They borrow some names and places and then make up everything else.
Remind me again why I like this movie? Even if it was a fictional movie and none of this actually existed, why did I like this movie? Why does this always happen to me? I can enjoy something in the moment when I'm watching it. It's fine. And then the second I start doing any research or talking to any of you guys, I hate it. Like, why does it happen to me?
That's always the unfortunate thing, man. It's like, you know how there's just like so many movies that I used to like more before I knew anything about the history of like racism or sexism or like any of those things. And then it was just ignorance was bliss. And now I watch movies and I'm like, I hate this. You can't go back.
We have talked about this before. Historical accuracy doesn't always matter as much when it's serving the story. And I feel like the lack of historical accuracy here isn't even serving the story. It's not serving the characters either. So it becomes entirely pointless.
That's the thing. They're not streamlining the story to make it easier to understand. They're not amalgamating a couple of characters just to, make it easier for the audience. It's like they're throwing in a bunch of stuff that never happened. For what?
For what? Yes. Maybe that should be the tagline of this movie.
For what?
Why? So we are back in 1951, still the wrong year. Nock and the police figure out that Turing has been picking up men for sex. No proof of that whatsoever, that this ever happened to him, I think. Nock believes that something more is afoot, because he doesn't want to be homophobic. They have a little conversation, and it's the conversation about, can machines think? So this is where the title comes in, because Alan Turing discusses with Nock the Imitation Game. What is the Imitation Game? I'm gonna say this in a concise way. It basically answers the question, am I human? or am I a machine? By asking questions.
Yeah, if I were in a room and then in another room there was a person and then in another room there was a computer and I was trying to figure out which of them was human and I was asking them all these questions, if the computer could convince me that it was the human one, then it would pass the quote unquote Turing test. They obviously chose it as the title for this movie because they're like, he's a robotic man who has computer android feelings, and he feels like he's playing the imitation game all the time, trying to pretend that he's human. Well, increasing pressure from her parents forces Joan to consider quitting her work at Bletchley Park, and Alan doesn't want her to go because they have really made Joan into the central emotional support in Alan's life, which I'm not sure was super realistic. But anyways, he doesn't want her to go, so he proposes to her, and they have a big engagement party. And that's where Karen Cross learns that Turing is gay. Like, Alan just kind of admits it to him. And he's like, maybe don't tell anyone about that. But this will be relevant later that Karen Cross knows that Alan is gay.
What is Karen Cross's nationality, George?
Oh my God. John Cancross was Scottish in real life. What Alan Leach is doing, I don't know.
Alan Leach is an Irish actor, am I correct?
Alan Leach is an Irish actor. You may have seen him as Branson in Downton Abbey, and he is here with a beautifully wandering accent to play John Cancross.
I don't get it, but fine. He's not supposed to be here anyway, so why do I care?
Yeah, he's not
Literally.
supposed to be here.
Yeah, I think in real life, Alan and Joan's relationship was a bit like, he did love her in a way, not in a romantic way necessarily, but they were pretty close friends, and he enjoyed that he could quote unquote talk to her like a man. So I think he often felt when he was speaking with women that he maybe didn't know like the right social cues necessarily, or, you know, they didn't want to talk about the things that he wanted to talk about, and he didn't feel that same way about Joan. And then they did get engaged and he met her parents, and it was like a whole thing. And then he eventually admitted to her that he had quote unquote homosexual tendencies, and she was like, that's fine. Don't worry about it. And he eventually broke things off with her just because I think he knew that over the long term, it was probably not going to go super well between them. But she becomes a sort of central figure in his life in this movie, and I don't really think that it was that way. They kept in touch after Bletchley, but they were not super tight or anything.
Yeah, it feels in this film like they're trying to make a big old doomed love story, and I don't get the vibe that it was that for either one of them. Like, they liked each other an awful lot, but that was it. And I suppose when you're in such a strange and forced proximity environment like Bletchley, your emotions are going to be weird and heightened anyway. Yeah, I can see them sort of having come to a mutual realization that this isn't going to happen. And I think that's what did happen.
I think this is one of the few things in the movie that I did not mind that much. I thought they were kind of connecting on an intellectual level, and I feel like the movie didn't do that bad of a job with that specific aspect, like with everything else, yes. But I didn't hate this specific thing.
She surfaces again later, right? Like, she visits him after he's had his whole run with the law, and, you know, they have this big acrimonious breakup. And my issue with her being this central emotional figure in his life is that Alan Turing did have relationships with men, and they just did not depict that in this movie. Like, you wouldn't know that he was gay unless they had this little scene where he admitted it to Karen Cross. It just seems like an interesting choice to me, where he's basically walking around like this man who has no sexual interest, when in fact we know that real Alan Turing was almost openly gay, as much as you could be openly gay at that time. Like, he really didn't hide it.
They could have done both, right? They could have shown him having relations with men, which he did, and then also finding a partner in Joan that he could speak with on a different level from other women. Like, they could have coexisted, but you're right, they did kind of take the easy way out by not giving him any male relationships. So they're having an engagement party, and during this party, they overhear a conversation between, I can see George already just cringing, between this other lady that works at Bletchley, and she's telling one of the other guys, Hugh Alexander, that her German on the other end of her code machine is talking about his girlfriend and naming his girlfriend in his coded messages. And that's how they figure out that there are repeated words within the code, and they can use those to break the code, or at least to limit the amount of settings that they have to check. So they make this big discovery, and I did think this moment was really quite tense, or the moment that followed. But again, this lady who works at Bletchley, who's gonna be smart as fuck because she works at Bletchley, just makes an offhand comment about this German's girlfriend, as if that's all she cares about.
Well, and also they were all sworn to secrecy, and she's just gonna like risk her job to like tell an entire bar about secret intelligence? Probably not.
Yeah, I feel like the different huts that they worked in, they didn't even communicate with each other in general, right? They weren't allowed to, like you said.
Yeah, this is also a pretty massive oversimplification of how they broke the Enigma code. Like, they realized pretty much immediately that there was going to be repeated words based on, the weather report and stuff like that, but that was just sort of one little square of the puzzle.
And I can understand wanting to put in a dramatic moment to have that sort of aha moment, but to then give one of like two female characters in the movie, the first one is like, oh my goodness, I've solved this puzzle and now I'm a code breaker. And the second is, oh, I've got this bit of information because I love my German co-worker on the other side. And he's got a girlfriend, and somebody else takes that to mean like this genius breakthrough. It's demeaning. It's incredibly demeaning.
Yeah, brutal.
Like I said, I did like the moment that follows when they're all racing back to that coded message and then they put the settings into Christopher and then it works. And I can imagine from that scene the feeling, what it must have been like when they did discover that they knew how to break codes.
I also think it was not just one moment like this either. They would break it like for a few days at a time, and then they would lose it again, and then they would break like part of it. And then after they had quote unquote broken the code and they pretty much could read all of the encrypted messages, then the Germans added another rotor. So there was like 6 months of dark period in 1942 where they had to crack the code again.
Yeah, this is what we talked about in our ex-company episodes too. But then they've cracked the code and they're super happy about it for 2 seconds. And then they realize, oh shit, we can't actually do much of anything because if we stop any sort of attack, then the Germans will know that we've broken their Enigma. And then what? Then we have to start all over again because they will add another rotor or they will change their machinery. They decode a bunch of messages and they can see where all the ships are. And Peter's brother is on one of the ships and he's like, if we use this knowledge that we have, we can stop this ship from sinking and we can save my brother. And it's another piece of conflict that wasn't there in real life.
I can understand them wanting to give Turing and his team a scene where they had to decide whether or not to act on the intelligence that they got, because this was something that the Allies had to grapple with. When do we act on information so that we won't tip off the Axis forces that we know about their attacks? And there were potentially scenarios where they had to let things happen that they could have prevented. But they had a lot of different tactics to make it look like they received their information in a different way. So I think one of the ones which was for convoys is that they would send out a reconnaissance plane, that they would make sure that this plane was noticed by the Germans. So the Germans would go, that's why they knew where we were at that time. And so they wouldn't risk the broken messages. But I think which is something that I believe Turing and Joan have to tell the head of MI6 later in this movie, is that they need to do something like that. So well done, Turing, for winning the war again.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And I mean, it would not have been up to Turing and co. to decide whether to use the intelligence. Like, that decision was way out of their pay grade. As you say, he goes to the head of MI6 and he's like, I'm going to design this statistical model so we can have these attacks and we'll choose which ones will cause the most damage, but it'll also help us save the most lives. And it's like, this is not real.
I don't know what it is with biopics about genius people, but they always have to bring up the God complex. Like, you can't be God, you're not God. And they always have to bring that up. It feels so trite to keep that stupid stereotype of genius as having a God complex. Isn't every single movie about a genius?
It is. It's genius by the numbers. It's completely insufferable.
Well, Turing discovers that Karen Cross is the Soviet spy who's been in their midst this whole time. But Karen Cross threatens to out him. And then there's this truly terrible thing that the movie does where they have Alan sort of stall for a while before he goes to Minji's and tells him that Karen Cross is a Soviet spy. And real life Alan Turing would never have done that, would never have put national security at risk just to prevent himself from being outed because he was basically out anyway. And he did take his oath of secrecy at Bletchley very seriously. So I just did not like that they implied that he would just let a spy slide if he knew about one, just for this reason. And then he goes home to his house and Minji's is there and he says that he's got Joan in jail for supposedly possessing decrypted intercepts, but it's just sort of a trick. And so Alan admits that Karen Cross is the spy in order to protect Joan. And then it turns out that Minji's already knew that Karen Cross was the Soviet spy and he was using him to feed misinformation to the Soviets. I don't know. It's a whole thing.
It's rude to the memory of Alan Turing to, first of all, make him not say it in the first place, and then second of all, to believe that he would be as clueless as to then accidentally tell him. You would have just told him right away. It's just a stupid movie choice that's, once again, very unnecessary because I don't even really know what purpose it serves.
I don't think anyone knew that Karen Cross was a spy before he got outed in, like, I think it was 1951. Like, during the war, nobody knew that Karen Cross was a Soviet spy. There's no evidence of that.
No, none at all. And I think even in 51, he was sort of investigated by association, but he wasn't formally outed. I think that came later, I think in the early 60s, if I recall. He wasn't even then publicly outed to the world until decades after that, because I think MI6 knew, but MI6 obviously kept that close to the chest.
Another thing that I don't like about this is that if you are gonna include Karen Cross, who wasn't with Alan Turing during this time, or at all, but if you're gonna include him, at least make it so that the audience who's not from the UK can have some understanding of who the fuck he is, because I think most people have no idea who the Cambridge Five are, unless you really like spies.
Which I do. So I know exactly who the Cambridge Five are.
Okay, time for George to explain to everyone who the Cambridge Five are.
The Cambridge Five, yeah, in a very short précis. I'm not mad that the Cambridge Five have attention on them. They are a very fascinating spy ring. I'm mad that they have attention on them in this movie where they did not have to be. The Cambridge Five were a group of young men who all went to Cambridge University. So I believe all of them were members of this elite social group called the Apostles. And it was out of this sort of academic ground that the Soviet Union recruited quite a few spies. And so they were all very highly educated young men. There was Anthony Blunt, there was Guy Burgess, there was Donald MacLean, and there was Kim Philby. And probably Kim Philby is the most famous of the spies. He certainly has the most books written about him. And John Cairncross was associated with this ring, but he wouldn't be officially named as one of the Cambridge Five until years and years later. So even after I believe he was outed as a spy, he wasn't necessarily known as one of the Cambridge spy ring, as it were. And they do name drop Burgess and MacLean in this film. And I do think that maybe the reason they changed the burglary to be 1951 is to associate that directly with the year that Burgess and MacLean defected to the Soviet Union. That became public knowledge in June 1951. So it makes sort of sense that if you've got a detective character who has got that in his head, and then you've got somebody he's looking at who seems to be mysterious and is also from this academic background, that he will have associated the two things. That's the only explanation I can think of as to why they changed it to 1951. But yes, so that's who the Cambridge Five are, and John Cairncross is part of that ring.
As pertains to the social context of what happened to Alan Turing, the discovery of these spies made the British look pretty bad. And there had been this sense, I think, before that if you had gone to a good school and if you were of a certain social class, they didn't really need to look into your background that much in Britain. And then it turned out there were all these Soviet spies in everyone's midst, and it made them look pretty bad to the Americans. This is, sort of during the early Cold War, right? And so the British decided that they needed to really tighten up their security protocols and try and root out spies and prevent this from happening again. And one of the fallouts from that was that there was this dramatically increased discrimination against LGBTQ public servants and candidates for government work because they felt that if you were a queer person, then you were more susceptible to blackmail. And this is the whole kind of social background of this environment where Alan Turing gets arrested for these homosexual quote unquote activities. And it kind of just makes me extra mad that they've thrown in this subplot where he's thought to be a spy because so many real gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender public servants and members of the military were actually rooted out and lost their jobs and lost everything because it was thought that they couldn't do their jobs because they might be a spy or they might be susceptible to blackmail.
Joan and Alan break up after he tries to convince her that she's got to leave Bletchley because he's bad news and he wants her to be safe. But she's like, don't be stupid, I'm gonna stay. So they both stay. Like,
they have this huge dramatic fight and she slaps him. It's a whole thing that, was not remotely how it happened in real life. Yeah, so the war comes to an end and all evidence of the work undertaken at Bletchley Park is destroyed so that no one will ever know that Enigma was broken, which lasted for like a few decades and then everyone knew Enigma had been broken. But at the time they were like, well, there could be another war. It's better if no one ever finds out that we broke this code. I don't know. I thought it was really interesting in the Turing biography. They talked a lot about how the Germans could have made Enigma truly uncrackable, but they were hugely arrogant about how good it was. And so there was a lot of little things they could have done to make their codes much harder to break, and they didn't do it because they trusted so heavily in the machinery. And so this whole thing where they're like, yeah, we don't want anyone to know that we broke Enigma. It's like, yeah, because you could make the Enigma code much harder to crack if you knew that other people were able to crack it.
Oh no, I don't like the scene. Back in 1928, young Alan is kind of waiting for his friend Christopher after they've parted ways for a summer break for 2 weeks. They're writing code to each other at this point. It's quite cute. They're writing code and they're doing all sorts of cute things. And Alan's like ready to say, I love you to this guy. And then he doesn't return because he's dead. And the principal of the boarding school just drops it on him. And then he's like, I don't really care. I'm not really that bothered. Like, he doesn't know how to feel. Which, once again, I think is not true. And also, I think he had some warning in real life that this friend was going to die.
So, Christopher Morecambe had contracted bovine tuberculosis when he was young from drinking infected milk. So, he was sick the whole time Alan knew him. But I don't think that Alan had the sense that this was going to be like an imminently fatal thing. Like, I don't think the headmaster dropped it on him quite like that, but I do think the death was a pretty devastating shock. He kept up a correspondence for many years with Christopher Morecambe's mother and his brother, and he went on holiday with the family and all that kind of stuff. So it really did leave a lasting hole in his life, I would say. Yeah, so it's 1951. Turing, well, 1952, as we know. Turing is convicted for his relationship with a man, and he is chemically castrated. There was this whole weird scientific thing at the time where they were like, some people were like, well, instead of throwing gay people in jail where we all know they belong, what if we treated them like they had a mental illness? And that was supposed to be better somehow. I think what happened in real life was that he had to undergo this chemical castration for a year. So I think for the first 9 months, he took pills regularly. And then the last 3 months, they put an implant in his leg. And he actually had to go and personally get the implant removed because they told him, they're like, yeah, it'll only last for 3 months. And he's like, that seems like bullshit. I'm going to go get it removed. And so the thing that I really enjoyed was that while he had this chemical castration going on, he was still going on trips to Norway and Greece and other places and sleeping with random dudes. So I'm like, congratulations. Well done, Alan Turing, for just completely being like, I don't give a shit. I'm going to keep doing what I want anyways. But in the movie, he's not responding quite as cheerfully, quite as keep calm and carry on as real life Alan Turing. He's in really bad shape, and Joan visits him one more time, and they have this whole conversation that I quite frankly watched at like 2.5 times the speed because I was like, I'm ready for this movie to be done.
The movie does eventually end, thankfully, for all of us. And we get, as we do in most World War II movies, we get an end card. It's like an overlay on, you see them burning all the papers at Bletchley. And it says, after a year of government-mandated hormonal therapy, Alan Turing committed suicide on June 7, 1954. He was 41 years old. Between 1885 and 1967. Although approximately 49,000 homosexual men were convicted of gross indecency under British law. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon, honoring his unprecedented achievements. Historians estimate that breaking Enigma shortened the war by more than 2 years, saving over 14 million lives. It remained a government-held secret for more than 50 years. Turing's work inspired generations of research into what scientists called Turing machines. Today, we call them computers.
George, do you have any thoughts on him being the inventor of the computer?
Yeah, I'm just going to read out what I said, which is Charles Babbage would like a word about the implication that Turing invented computers. I think he can lay claim to that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also now some dispute over whether or not Turing really did die by suicide, because as we discussed earlier, he was doing some experiments with cyanide in his home and he could be a little absent-minded, and the inquest into his death was not particularly thorough. And he had completed his year of chemical castration 14 months before his death, and he really did seem to put a brave face on it. I mean, he wasn't having the best time while it was happening, but I feel like the movie makes it seem like this happened to him and it was just world ending, and so he ended his life. I'm not sure that was the vibe in real life.
I just think it's really sad to be 41 and to think there's no place for me in the world. Which, I mean, I can understand why he would feel that way, but such a sad world to be living in at the time. Especially after what you've meant to a country that then kicked you while you were already down. It was like, fuck you. You don't matter anymore because you're homosexual.
Well, yeah, I
It's
think that's
just-
one of the real tragedies of this film being so bad and by inventing the espionage plot is that the real life horrors that happened to Alan Turing were big and hard and sad enough and tragic enough to have been given the attention without inventing this whole other thing for him to be dealing with. And I think it's very disrespectful that we don't give space to that.
For sure. Now that I think about it, it's even crazier to me that we don't really see anything of him having relationships with men. They just completely wiped that out of the movie, except where he says it to Karen Cross at one point, which is necessary for this dumb spy subplot. And then he gets chemically castrated for a crime, quote unquote, that we like never see him engage in. It's just so weird to me. If you want to make that such a big part of the movie, then I feel like you should show him having the fullness and the richness and the extent of relationships that he did have with men. Well, I have some notes because Turing did break the Enigma code, but he did other stuff too. Well, he did help break the Enigma code, we'll say. He designed this machine called the Automatic Computing Engine in 1945. Basically, there was this sort of arms race between the British and the Americans, except it was a race to see who could build the first better computer, I suppose. And so this was an early British electronic serial stored program computer design, although unfortunately he sort of got hamstrung in his work by people who didn't really see his vision, so his design never was fully realized and he eventually quit the project. And in 1950, he published this paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, wherein he indeed considered the question of whether machines could think, and so this is also considered quite a seminal work in computer science. And then he did his thing that he sometimes did, where he got tired of working in a particular framework and he moved on. So he started doing experiments on morphogenesis. He was always curious about patterns that repeat in nature. Quite a few people who knew him would comment on, he would show them how pine cones have these repeating circular patterns. And he was very interested in like, how do things decide how to grow? And how can we apply, logical mathematical processes to that? And so that's kind of what he was working on towards the end of his life.
Makes me wonder, what if he'd been alive today? What would he think of where computers have ended up going? Does a computer have intelligence? Can it think? Those questions are very relevant today, so it would have been so interesting to have him still alive today.
Yeah, for sure. And just lastly, there was a petition that was launched alongside this movie, and the campaign featured Benedict Cumberbatch, Stephen Fry, and Turing's great niece, Rachel Barnes. And this petition sort of snowballed into this movement that eventually resulted in the Policing and Crime Act of 2017, which granted amnesty to men who were convicted under anti-gay legislation in England and Wales. So Turing was pardoned in 2013, and then 4 years later, all of the 49,000 men who had been charged under these laws were granted amnesty.
I guess at least one good thing came from the movie then.
But let's not forget this was less than a decade ago that this happened. This was long,
I
long
know, it's
overdue.
sad.
Yeah,
Why?
truly. And the only reason why it even came up was because Alan Turing was a fucking war hero who saved millions of lives. And that was the only reason why it even became a thing that we think and talk about. All these people who had their lives completely derailed by just being born gay and getting caught.
Dare I ask, do we want to rate this movie? And what out of? Maybe unnecessary spy subplots out of 10.
Perfect. How many unnecessary spy subplots out of 10 would you rate this movie, George?
Well, it was absolutely one whole unnecessary spy subplot out of 10 because it had one and it shouldn't have done. But if I wanted to rate it as anything else, it would be please don't ever make me watch this movie again out of 10. Thank you.
Nailed it. I feel like you really got the spirit of our rating system. What about you, Mart?
I will admit, before research and before watching the movie a second time, I was going to rate it an 8.5 for being a decent movie. And it's gone down a bit. I'll rate it for unnecessary spy subplots out of 10 because I think they kept me entertained. It wasn't slow, the acting was pretty good. So it gets a 4. Like, I'll give it a 4 for the great number of good actors in this, but nothing else. How about you?
Yeah. The thing is that I think that if you don't know anything about Alan Turing and you don't care to know anything about Alan Turing, you'll probably think this movie is fine. You know, it looks nice. The acting is pretty good. I think the script is kind of clunky in places, but not irredeemably terrible, except that it's purporting to be a movie about Alan Turing, and it's just not really a very good movie about Alan Turing. And yeah, I didn't totally despise this movie before I read the book. And then I read the book, and I just sort of felt like, do the people who make this movie even like Alan Turing? He's another character that sort of reminded me of people who were perhaps a bit difficult to know by people around them. Like we've talked about Lee Miller before and Mo Berg, where they were sort of hard to know, or people only felt like they maybe knew a portion of their personality. And I just have seen so many biopics at this point that I just really missed the mark on getting the vibe of those people right. And yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer is because I'm not a filmmaker, but yeah, I think that if you have the patience to go through a 660-page book by a professor of mathematics who really wants you to understand the mathematics, you should definitely check out the book. You don't need to watch the movie. And so I'm going to give it 5 unnecessary spy subplots out of 10.
How did you rate it higher than I did?
I don't think in a vacuum it's a irredeemable film. I just don't think it's a good movie about Alan Turing.
Yeah, fair. I'm gonna move on and ask you both if you're reading anything, and I'll start with you, George.
Am I reading anything? I know that I wasn't supposed to come on here and talk about the SAS, but I will say that I am reading a book about Operation Bullbasket, which is an SAS operation after the drop after D-Day.
Well, I really feel like the people do expect you to talk about the SAS, so.
I mean, if we ever do get a season 3, we need you to know all this.
Absolutely. I do have a different closing remark as well, which is to urge anyone who has seen this film or hasn't seen this film and just wants to find out anything about Alan Turing, who can, to visit Bletchley Park, because what they've done is they've got the mansion open with a lot of exhibitions inside it about how it was set up during the time. They've recreated a bunch of the huts that were in use at the time, and it's a fantastic walkthrough. Turing's office is one of the things that you can walk through. Even when you sit in the park bit outside, next to the pond, they have a beautiful audioscape in the trees with speakers giving you like the sounds of conversations and things. So it's a really interesting, really immersive visit. You do really get a sense of what it was like to be at that park.
That sounds awesome.
Cool. What are you reading, Sam?
I have started Red Tail Captured, Red Tail Free Memoirs of a Tuskegee Airman in POW by Alexander Jefferson because we are going to talk about Masters of the Air very soon.
Guess who with?
George is going to become our jack of all trades correspondent.
I'm looking forward to it.
Ask me what I'm reading.
What are you reading?
I'm reading 3 books at the same time. It's kind of confusing. One of them is Dutch. In English, it's called The Girl with the Red Hair. It's about a Dutch spy. And not spy, a resistance lady. See, this is what happens when you put unnecessary spy subplots into movies. And the other book I'm reading is about Maartje Googled, but I think I talked about it on the last podcast, so let's skip that. And then the third one I've started reading is another book about the same Dutch resistance lady. I've got 3 books about the same person. I'm insane. There's also a movie, so we can watch the movie if we can find a subtitled version of it somewhere that's not Dutch.
I'll follow along.
Well, thank you, George, for being on our pod once again.
Thank you for having me back. I love it here.
And thank you so much, everybody else, for listening. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. You can send this episode to a friend who would also like to hate on it. You can rate us 5 stars, even though we do sometimes hate on movies. And you can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast, or visit our website, rosiethereviewer.com. See you next week.
Bye.